If an MMT platform were intervene right now, this is kind of the short list of what I would do in the U.S., in a country like the United States. Number one, mandate paid sick leave and parental leave. Number two, extend unemployment compensation to all workers, including freelancers, gig economy workers, paid at 100% compensation up to a certain annual limit of, say, $45,000, $50,000, $60,000, depending on how generous you want to be. Number three, phase in Medicare for all, at least at a first step immediately, to cover all COVID-19 testing and illnesses and COVID-19 related illnesses, especially including mental health care, given the level of stress and anxiety and depression that we're seeing in the U.S. Number four, expand food stamp assistance, or what we call in the U.S. the SNAP assistance system.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub. And in a few minutes, me and Patricia are going to be talking to Fadhel about the response to the coronavirus pandemic, which is set against a backdrop of ongoing environmental crisis. I know it's all pretty dystopian, but also we're going to be talking about how MMT can help citizens, activists, and general participants in a democracy understand what's happening and how to advocate for positive change. So before we go any further, here's a date for your diary, April 22nd, which is Earth Day 2020. And as part of Earth Day, our friend and colleague George Topolides in Melbourne, Australia, is organising an event called MMTers Marching Online for Earth Day 2020. And where else can you march these days? We'll be talking more about that later in the episode, and there's a link to more information about the event in the show notes. So, if this is your first time listening, you might be thinking, how can an economic theory help anybody right now? What this moment calls for is action, and on a grand scale. Well, I think you're right, and the political moment we're in right now has spawned amazing organisations like Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement, and public sentiment is in alignment with the goals of these movements. But it's generally the case that by the time progressive policy proposals meet the grim world of politics, politicians inevitably shift the conversation to money. And they say, how are you going to pay for all of this? How do you support whole communities financially if you shut down coal mines? How do you pay for solar panels, universal healthcare, mass transit systems, world-class high-speed internet so everybody can work remotely and burn less fuel? It all sounds great, but how are you going to pay for all of that? Because we're out of money. We just spent it all on financial crises and bombing the Middle East. We barely had enough left over to pay for the pay rise we just gave ourselves. How are you going to pay for all this stuff, you big-hearted, morally correct and yet hopelessly naive activist? Well, we think that MMT is the answer to that question. Yes, a theory can't shut down polluting industries or transform the way we produce and consume. People do that, but people need a vision of how we get from here to there, and MMT can help with the how to pay for it piece of the puzzle. So here goes. If you're a monetarily sovereign government and you need to support workers' lost income or pay for surgical masks or respirators or people to make those things, you pay for them the same way you pay for, say, a $1.5 trillion financial injection to help the stock market, which also happens to be the same way governments pay for everything. And that is by typing numbers into a computer at a central bank. I know it sounds hard to believe for the rest of us who have to work really hard for money to show up in our bank accounts, but that's how spending works if you're a monetarily sovereign government like, say, the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, or Australia. Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve, was asked during the 2008 financial crisis if he was using taxpayer money to bail out the banks. And he said, no, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. In 2014, the Bank of England put out a paper called Money Creation in the Modern Economy, which affirmed that this is indeed how central banks function. And this very week, the Bank of England has again put out more statements reaffirming this. And that's why your government right at this moment isn't scrabbling around trying to find dollars or pounds or yen. It just types dollars, pounds or yen into existence using keystrokes at a central bank, not just in a crisis, but every time the government spends. So the idea of a currency issuing government running out of money is as silly as you or I saying, I'm sorry, I can't send you an email because I've run out of emails. If you need more information on how governments spend, listen to our first 3 episodes to get up to speed. Or you could listen to our episode 13 with Dr. Stephen Hale if you want more complexity. Now, my personal concern is that when this pandemic crisis has been mitigated, whether that's in 3 months' time or 6 months' time or a year, politicians and the interests they represent will try and use the fact that governments increased their spending in this crisis to justify cutting spending after the crisis. And we know what they always like to cut. And if they don't succeed in that, it'll be because enough of us know how modern money systems work. And that's why we do this podcast. So, before we dive in, just to let you know, I'm still working on my MMT live show in the hope that it will be ready for the Edinburgh Festival in August 2020. At the time of recording, the whole festival itself is still hanging in the balance. It might go ahead, it might not. But it's always been my intention to put the show online anyway at some point, but I just would have rather waited until after I'd performed it at the festival for a month so that it'd be in better shape. But as it is, I might have to figure out another way to show it to you. I'll link to my webpage about the show in the show notes, and there'll be updates there as soon as I get them. Finally, just wanted to say, I know everybody's having a really hard time financially right now, so I wanted to re-emphasize our gratitude to our patrons. It means so much to us that you're continuing to support us, especially at this uncertain time. If you're not a patron, but you are, say, an eccentric millionaire or a recent recipient of any bailout money, we'd really appreciate your support via patreon.com/MMT podcast, and there's a link in the show notes. If you're not able to support us that way, the support you give us in other ways by recommending us to other people and, of course, by paying us with your time and attention is vital to our aim, which is to demystify economics for everybody so we can have better information to work with when we're thinking about and debating the best way forward for our respective countries and communities. So thanks for listening. Let's dive in. Welcome to the MMT podcast, everybody. We're here with Fadhel Kaboub. It's always a pleasure to have you, Fadhel. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Pleasure. We've got Patricia Pino.
Hi.
The main host. Obviously, I'm just the co-host. So later, we're going to be talking about Earth Day, which is on 22nd of April, 2020, and where the MMT community and, of course, the MMT insights fit in with that. But first, I don't think we can go any further without talking about coronavirus and quarantine and lockdown and the effect that it's having on this thing we call the economy, and also what a rational economic policy response might look like. So I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest we haven't seen a rational economic policy response yet over there in the States or here in the UK. They're doing something, but is it enough? Fadhel, please dive in anywhere and just tell us your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I want to say that the Earth Day event that we were planning speaks directly to this. I mean, this was planned way before the pandemic that we're dealing with right now was with us. And I must say that this is an online Earth Day rally that we were planning. So we were planning on social distancing before it was even cool or required. So the rally is going to happen on Earth Day on the 22nd. It's going to be a whole week of online activities linking the MMT framework to Earth Day and climate change. And, to bring us back to the discussion about the pandemic, this may not be the last one that we're going to deal with in our lifetime. And climate scientists have been warning us about the effects of climate change and the potential for more frequent pandemics of this kind. So we're caught off guard at this moment in terms of our public health systems across the world are not ready for this. Our economic system is not resilient enough to deal with the effects of pandemic. So back to your question, most governments today are essentially scrambling in a panic mode to deal with the public health crisis on the one hand, and with the shortages that we have in terms of medical and public health capacity to deal with the volume of patients. And number two, scrambling to deal with the economic consequences of the self-quarantine requirements that we know are the only way to slow down the spread of the virus and to allow the public health infrastructure to prioritize and to handle the consequences of the pandemic. So in terms of policy solutions, the dominant set of solutions that you've seen in the US and other places is we're shutting down businesses and people are staying home as a requirement. I mean, in some countries, it's actually a military curfew, at least for most of the day. In many countries in the Middle East, this is the case. So the question is, how do we make sure that businesses survive? How do we make sure that individuals actually have a source of income to pay rent, to pay their mortgage, to pay their student loan debt, to pay all their debts, and to buy enough food and basic supplies? And this is especially true for people who are not able to work from home remotely, for people who happen to be the most vulnerable in society, for the homeless population, for the elderly. So the main solution that you've seen around the world is let's send them checks. And this got our UBI friends fired up about this. So, see, we told you so. We need UBI. But for some reason...
Oh, yeah, George Bush invented UBI.
Milton Friedman, before all of them, had this negative income tax concept. So if you ask me, and you ask most of the people in the MMT community, what should be the more structural response to this crisis? Number one, we do recognize that people need cash. People need a source of income to buy basic food supplies, to have internet access, to pay their rent. But nobody's saying, well, maybe we should hit the pause button, not on the podcast, the pause button as a figure of speech, on mortgage payments, on evictions, on student loan payments. Maybe we should cancel student debt to begin with. And this is something that the MMT community has been advocating for a while. So essentially putting a pause on all debt payments, interest payments, fees, taxes, and so on, so that at least people, when they're staying at home, they don't have to worry about being evicted. They don't have to worry about losing their house or their credit score being affected. Then the next thing you worry about is how do we make sure that people are provisioned at an appropriate level for food and shelter and basic necessities. Then we can figure out a way to send targeted payments to individuals who are not able to work remotely, who don't have a secure source of income. And especially when we say we're going to put a moratorium on rent payments, some landlords, especially elderly families, they rely on a single property as their source of income. So when we put a pause on rent, we can target cash payments to landlords who rely on that source of income exclusively for their livelihood. So this way, we're not sending cash to everybody, and we're not randomly, throwing cash at the entire system. So this is one aspect of making sure that everybody's taken care of. The homeless population in the U.S. has been in a crisis pre-pandemic, and now the crisis is even double, because we're asking people to stay at home and to decongregate away from large crowds. And you look at most homeless shelters in the U.S., they're housing hundreds of people in such a small, tiny space. So they're also in a panic mode, trying to figure out alternative modes of sheltering the homeless population. So you have all of these structural issues that we've been calling for from before the pandemic, to have a resilient system that can handle a recession, that can handle a crisis. And if you pay attention to what the MMT community has been saying in terms of job guarantee versus UBI versus public services, there's 3 layers in the MMT policy design. The first layer is universal public services, and that includes healthcare. universal healthcare and well-paid, well-provisioned healthcare system, education, public transportation, and so on. That's number one. And sovereign governments can afford that. We have the resources, we have the technology. So that's the universal level, including universal childcare. And if you have a decent public sector that actually gives people the right to paid sick leave, gives people the right to parental leave, this way, today most parents are dealing with the crisis in a secondary way, in the sense of having to work remotely and homeschool their kids. Because most parents are not taking the risk of bringing in babysitters or other family members to care for their kids. So that's doubling the crisis. And if we're really trying to slow down the pandemic in a significant way, the 2 weeks that they're talking about is just the beginning. If we're really trying to flatten the curve, I see this going into 2 to 3 months at least, until we see significant numbers really flattening the curve below the public health capacity to handle the new cases. We don't have the full numbers right now because we don't have enough testing capacity to figure out how many people are actually need treatment and what the public health capacity is. So when we say public health capacity, this is also one of the core MMT principles, that it's not having all the money in the world is not going to save us from a pandemic. What will save us from a pandemic is having the doctors, the hospital beds, the ventilators, the protective gear for doctors and nurses to deal with the pandemic. So again, no money will save us from this. And I have to emphasize that, most people are paying attention to the US and Italy and China, and very little coverage we're seeing about developing countries. Developing countries, to begin with, have limited public health capacity, partly because of the neoliberal policies of the last 30, 40 years of prioritizing debt payments and prioritizing industrialization and not really investing in public health, sanitation, and hospitals and so on. And this pandemic is not going to spare any country. It's already spreading. And if we in the United States and Western Europe and Japan are finding it really hard to manage the load on the public health sector and to produce enough test kits to screen patients, then you can imagine what the situation is in developing countries and what the impact of the pandemic is. And because their public health infrastructure is much more limited than the US or Europe, then flattening the curve in those countries means a much more severe and much longer duration for the quarantine requirements, if we were to really flatten the curve in those countries. So it's a double crisis for developing countries, because we've talked about this several times on the show, that if you have limited monetary sovereignty, and the case for developing countries, they're so dependent on food imports, on energy imports, and most importantly on medical resources imports. So a pandemic like this and future pandemics, which we're likely to see, is always going to hit developing countries the hardest, economically, and then on the public health and on the humanitarian side.
So if anybody is listening to this podcast and they happen to be in a developing country, what can we say? Because you've got limited policy options because you don't have monetary sovereignty. How does that help a person on the ground? What can they say?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, we're seeing this in some developing countries. Just before we started the show, I was watching this video that a friend of mine posted from Tunisia of factory workers, female factory workers in a factory that produces medical equipment like protective gear and things like that, have voluntarily self-quarantined themselves in the factory for a number of days to continue producing the necessary equipment, not just for Tunisia, but some of it is actually for export to Europe. So we're going to have to go into a wartime mode of production, where, if we have to self-quarantine, you self-quarantine workers at the workplace to produce the necessary medical equipment, to produce the necessary food supply and basic necessities, and shut down everything else. Because if we're staying at home, you want to make sure that people are, have access to information. So access to internet is important. Access to electricity and water is important. So those are vital public services. Having access to food is very important. And then obviously the medical equipment necessary to handle the crisis. So we're essentially bringing the entire economic system to its bare minimal activity to continue to supply the basic necessities. So if I may go back to the list of the 3 layers of the MMT platform, one is universal public services, because that's extremely important. Number 2 is a job guarantee for people who want to work, and in this case, who can work and should work, in terms of the basic necessary supply chain required in any country. And then number 2, the MMT community has always talked about a generous income support for people who cannot work or should not work. In this case, people who should not work is a large number of people who are being asked to self-quarantine. So we've never opposed essentially a basic income support for people who should not be working for health reasons or for family commitment reasons. And we've called for this in different ways, in the sense that we should have a generous sick pay leave. We should have a generous parental leave that supports family members who are taking care of an elderly parent or taking care of young children, or in this case, homeschooling children. That's useful, productive work for society that just happens not to be quantified in GDP, but should be remunerated at a decent wage and benefits and so on. In this case, the requirements of the public health crisis dictates that we must do that. And this way, we don't have to worry about people losing their homes and reducing the amount of stress and anxiety that many people are struggling with right now. And the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen in 2 weeks, what's going to happen in 3 months.
So I would just like to make the point that we want these conditions, we want jobs with these conditions like paid maternity leave, statutory sick pay, generous sick pay and things. And the way to guarantee that everybody gets those is via the job guarantee. If the job guarantee job has a fortnight's holiday and, sick pay at a certain level, that means that all the private sector has to follow suit, or they're not going to get anybody showing up for work. So, at this time of talking about basic income and, people need checks because they just can't leave the house and, either they're quarantining or they're actually sick themselves. So, basic income totally makes sense. Like you say, they can't work. But having a job that supports you like that, the route to everybody having that job as a sort of right, as a baseline thing that you can count on, is to have have it in the job guarantee, basically.
Yeah, with the thing is that I've heard some MMT people discuss the job guarantee recently a lot as well, and obviously it's the preferred option. There is there's an argument that says that we need something fast, and the job guarantee needs time to be set up, etc. How feasible would it be as a kind of short-term job guarantee solution to just simply subsidize the workers of non-for-profits and people who are pretty much already doing a lot of the work that needs to be done in terms of looking after the elderly, making sure people have food, etc., but who simply do not have the resources at the moment, and basically government just giving them, a free rein as to employ as many people as you want, we'll cover it.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, just you're talking about the charity sector. Right now, the relevant charity sector, instead of it being relying on people's charity, the government should be making money, funds available to them to do what they need to do to get
not for profit,
to look
obviously.
after people.
I know that that's a slightly different structure to how we usually talk about the job guarantee, which is locally funded and maybe organized, and people decide on jobs. But I thought that as a kind of immediate,
centrally funded, locally organised, So,
but I thought that as an immediate response, something that just needed to happen as quickly as possible, that was an option that we could have. I think the way things have been dealt with in America and the UK have been quite similar, in the sense that our leaders share a similar ideology and therefore have the same kind of approach to the economy that dictates that you must leave things alone for as long as possible. And that's their preference. It's like they'll do government intervention if they must, but they really resent it.
Well, they're starting from a baseline assumption of like, what we want is business has to continue. We just presume that. It's just a force of nature. It has to
protect
continue.
the free market.
So yeah, but just the way we do production and consumption, whatever you want to call that, capitalism. Who knows what it is in reality? The way we do things now, whatever we call that, it's like no, that has to continue. So we use that as our primary thing to structure what's going to happen next, and then you get to just give people spending money, and instead of going right, this production and consumption pattern that we're in, it's completely vulnerable to things like this. And it was completely vulnerable to climate change as well. And, this has brought it to a head. How do we restructure so it's not vulnerable?
Exactly. I mean, this crisis is shining a light on so many structural weaknesses, especially the trend that we've been pursuing the last few years of Uberizing the economy and the gig economy, and kind of shifting the burden of the cost of doing business onto workers as opposed to corporations. And look what's happening to the Uber drivers now. Look what's happening to self-employed artists and musicians and workers freelancers across the whole system. There is no safety net. There is no union. There is no pension plan. There is no unemployment insurance. So that's why we've been calling for expanding unemployment insurance, at least during this crisis, to cover all self-employed workers at full pay up to a certain limit, say $50,000 a year or $60,000 a year, to make sure that workers who are self-employed can also sustain themselves during this crisis. We're talking about restaurant workers who are working part-time jobs and so on.
Just want to ask really quickly, for the benefit of the audience, what is unemployment insurance in America?
So unemployment compensation in the U.S. covers up to 6 months worth of unemployment. Okay. And it only covers people who are working full-time prior to losing their job. And it doesn't cover 100%. It covers a certain percentage depending on their income and employment status. I mean, it's helpful when somebody's transitioning during an unemployment situation. And this is if they've been laid off involuntarily, if we're not fired, in other words. So this crisis is obviously a crisis of a different nature because it covers everybody. So today you end up in a situation where a lot of people who actually qualify for unemployment compensation are actually able to work remotely. So they're not actually losing their jobs. So not all workers, obviously. But in many cases, so many people are left out of the unemployment compensation system. And the unemployment compensation system is not built to handle the entire workforce, being unemployed. Yeah. It's always built on kind of normal business cycle fluctuations of, 5-10% unemployment. Here we're talking about, in terms of the impact of this recession. Some people compare it to 9/11, some people compare it to 2008, some people compare it to 2008 and 9/11 combined. This is going to dwarf those numbers by far. I mean, the only reasonable comparison would be a Great Depression of the 1920s in Europe and 1930s in the US.
Okay, so let me ask, let's try and bring it back to the real world and project our ideal circumstances. If you were running the government, Fadhel, in a country that had resources like the UK or the US, what would the interplay between the job guarantee and basic income and all the other safety nets that we'd have in place in a rational government, what would that interplay look like on the ground right now? You get this virus appears, you go on lockdown, lots of people aren't able to do the real world activity that was paying their rent, paying their mortgage. What would it look like if we were doing it right? So
if an MMT platform were intervene right now, this is kind of the short list of what I would do in the US, in a country like the United States. Number one, mandate paid sick leave and parental leave. Number two, extend unemployment compensation to all workers, including freelancers, gig economy workers, paid at 100% compensation up to a certain annual limit of, say, $45,000, $50,000, $60,000, depending on how generous you want to be. Number three, phase in Medicare for all, at least at a first step immediately, to cover all COVID-19 testing and illnesses and COVID-19 related illnesses, especially including mental health care, given the level of stress and anxiety and depression that we're seeing in the U.S. Number 4, expand food stamp assistance, or what we call in the U.S. the SNAP assistance system. Expand it, number 1, to bring it back to its original level, because the Trump administration just cut it a few weeks ago, actually cut the food assistance program in the U.S. So make it more generous and expand it.
Okay, right. When you say expand it, do you mean it should pay more per person, or they contracted it by throwing some people out of the eligibility bracket? How did that work?
So we want to expand it to make it more generous in terms of dollar amount per person, and to expand it to other people who are now being asked to stay home and have no source of income. We want to expand safe housing and shelter availability for the homeless population, especially during this crisis. But also, this is a permanent thing, pre-crisis, the housing for the homeless. And then you have targeted cash payments to individuals, small business owners who are not able to qualify for any of the things that I just mentioned. You want to have, this is the most important thing, I think, that will reduce the level of stress and anxiety, a mandatory moratorium on foreclosures, evictions, payments on mortgages, credit cards, rent, fees and taxes and penalties of all kinds, so that people can just stay home and not worry about debt payments, at least during the duration of the crisis.
That's the easiest thing to do, isn't it? Because really we're asking you just go, look, just do nothing.
Right, exactly.
Don't collect that tax. Exactly. Don't send that bailiff out. Don't, it doesn't require a massive deployment of resources.
Exactly. And for the financial institutions who are would be the recipients of those payments, we already have a central bank that can handle the stability of the financial system. So it's not going to be a complete collapse of the system. Yeah. We're just hitting the pause button, and central banks know how to make sure that banks have enough liquidity and to continue to operate. We've been calling for canceling student loan debt from before this crisis. Yeah. This is the time to do it. Remember when we said cancel the student debt, $1.5 trillion, they said, we don't have the money. Who's going to pay for it? All of a sudden, $1.5 trillion appeared at the Fed, and all of a sudden now there's $1 trillion that appeared to deal with the crisis. All the things we've been calling for, Medicare for all, we were told it's too expensive, we can't afford it, it's socialism. All of a sudden, we want, free healthcare for everybody as a human right, people are now calling it. And we're talking literally just 2 weeks ago, people were just saying we can't do that, we shouldn't, we don't have the money for it. So this is kind of the MMT moment, shining a light on the reality of how governments pay for things. And then
it's sad that it's come like this, though.
I know, and we've been saying we don't want the crisis, we don't want the Great Depression to shine a light on how governments operate. But unfortunately, this is where we are today. And then very important is to ramp up production of essential medical equipment, protective gear, food, to make sure that the basic supply chain that we need to deal with the crisis is there to serve the public health sector and to serve food and basic necessities for people who are now required to stay home. And then in addition to this, and this is very important from an MMT perspective, and when people worry about inflation, prosecute price setters, price gouging behavior, go after the price setters who are setting prices before the crisis. And in the case of the U.S., we know who the price setters are. They're the health insurance companies, they're the private hospitals, it's the big pharmaceutical companies. And who is President Trump making the champions of this moment? It's the public-private partnership with Big Pharma. And somehow our progressive friends are lining up behind the president saying, yes, this is what we need to do. And they're going to walk away from this crisis with more market power, with more influence in politics than ever before. Yeah,
they're going to do for those guys what they did for the bankers in 2008, basically.
And what all of these things mean is really the whole motivation that comes out of the MMT policy platform, which is building more structural resilience in the system. Because, again, these pandemics will become more frequent with the effects of climate change. And if we're going to face another crisis like this in 10 years or 20 years or who knows when, we want to be ready to go into a crisis mode without the panic, without the shortages, without the internet breaking because we don't have enough bandwidth to handle remote working and remote teaching and remote learning. So we need to build these automatic safety nets in the system in the same way we've been talking about a job guarantee as an automatic safety net, that kind of the buffer for the system during a regular business cycle. And the same way we talk about healthcare for all as an automatic safety net for everybody as a human right. We have a bunch of these automatic safety nets in the system, but they don't tend to focus on the most vulnerable people during crisis. We've seen it in the stock market. When the market was in a free fall, essentially last week, there's a built-in automatic trigger that kicks in, and they call it the circuit breaker, and it just stops all trading to stop the market from a free fall. Well, where is the automatic trigger for the system when we exceed a certain amount of CO2 emissions? Say, time out, let's stop. This is too much. Let's pause the system. Where is the automatic trigger when unemployment starts to pick up? Where is the automatic trigger when homelessness increases? We don't have any of these automatic triggers for the most vulnerable portion of the population, but we have it for Wall Street. We have it for corporations. We're calling for government assistance and bailouts. So we just need these automatic stabilizers to build strong resilience in the system economically, but especially from a public health perspective during crises, but also during normal economic times.
Or what we could do as individuals in the Western world is just all of us just incorporate, and then we become corporations, and that's how we can get our governments to care about us. But anyway, that's just I'm laughing at my own stuff here. That's really bad. So we're out there, we're advocating for this stuff, and people are seeing the need for this stuff. You know, all these measures that you just outlined, Fadhel. Let's presume that we've made a pretty good fist of proving to people, look, the money is typed into existence at the central bank. Okay, you don't need to worry about that part now. And you touched on it briefly. The next thing they worry about is inflation. So, you know, and we worry about that too. That's the rational response, isn't it? Not, have we got the money? Yes, of course we've got, you know, the government's got infinite money. You know, what kind of spending is going to trigger inflation? And so here we're talking about putting lots of money into the economy at a time when everybody's staying home and not engaging in the usual real world productive activity they would be doing. So what we're looking at there is increase in money, decrease in productivity. You can see, you know, that people get scared about inflation in that instance. What do we say to people? How do we address that concern about inflation?
Well, to begin with, there's really no risk of inflation at this point because the government is not spending $1 trillion on top of what the public and the private sector is normally spending. This is kind of to offset the massive decline in private sector spending. So that's one element, which means we could actually be spending way more than $1 trillion. That's one factor. But as we've said in the MMT literature very clearly, what matters is not the spending per se or the quantity of money that you're adding in the system. What matters is, does the economy have enough productive capacity to meet the new demand that's triggered by this new spending? And as you can see in the United States, at least, it's very clear from the government what they're talking about. They're not talking about the money. They're talking about mobilizing the resources. So they're talking about shortages of medical equipment. That's really the thing that matters. In terms of food, the U.S. food supply chain is pretty resilient. I mean, the U.S. is one of the biggest food producers on the planet, with lots of actually stockpiles of food reserves in the U.S. The food buffer stock system is pretty plentiful in the U.S. So I'm not worried about food inflation and shortages, extended shortages in the case of the U.S. But this may be the case in some other countries, especially developing countries, that rely on food imports for basic necessities. And when you have a global pandemic of that nature, and if a country like Australia decides to put restrictions on its wheat exports, if a country like the Ukraine decides to put restrictions on its wheat exports, then all the developing countries that are dependent for like basic food staples, I'm thinking of a lot of countries in the Middle East because of the food culture, we import a lot of wheat. Then we're going to have wheat shortages in many countries around the world, which means prices are going to rise. And it doesn't matter how much money you have and how much you have in reserves. you're still going to face food price inflation and food shortages. The same would be true for medical equipment. In developing countries, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the medical basic necessities are imported, whether it's basic medicine or safety gear that's required for public health institutions. That's where we see the shortages. And that's where you see the price gouging behavior, starting to kick in some cases, whether it's, in the kind of the free market or in the black market, because there's lots of, in times of crisis, this is where you see the black market thriving, especially in developing countries, and cross-border trafficking of items that are feeding into the inflation spiral. So from an MMT perspective, it's really the productive capacity that matters. And that's why we're saying in times of crisis, it's extremely important to continue supporting the supply chain for basic necessities. And that's how you prevent inflation. And you go after the price-setting behavior, obviously.
Yeah, the issue of inflation is funny, isn't it? Because you're actually, as far as I understand it, you're actively trying to reduce, as Christian said, your productive capacity, because you're telling people to stay at home, but at the same time, you want to avoid a recession. It almost seems like you're fighting against yourself a bit, because it's like a self-inflicted recession. Is that the right way of seeing it? And also, when it comes to food supplies, I mean, the UK, as far as I know, imports 50% of its food. Am I right, Christian? I'm looking at you.
Right. Okay. Yeah, let me just check my...
Come on, but we do waste quite a lot.
I did write an academic paper on this this morning, and it's just gone out of my head.
My concern, I guess, is more like what happens if we start losing workers in the food production process to quarantine or to self-isolation? And then we actually have, struggling to get people onto those industries to keep the supply side going. Is that a possibility at all? Is that far-fetched?
It is a possibility, and that's why a lot of countries are thinking in wartime production mode, in which you have multiple shifts of workers to produce war materials. But in this case, because of the public health crisis associated with it, you want to have, the critical components of the labor force in these critical supply chains working in a safe public health environment, which means, as I said, the example of the Tunisian workers who self-quarantined on the workplace to make sure that they continue. But we don't want to shift the burden on individual and saying you have to self-quarantine on the workplace and continue abusing workers who are underpaid to begin with. But we want to put in place a resilient public health system and a resilient supply chain that pays people decent wages and benefits. And if you go into a crisis mode production, just like when you are working overtime, you get paid time and a half and you get paid bonuses for the extra work that you're putting during a crisis. So in some cases, we may have to, if this situation persists for several months, we may have to rely on critical intervention in the food industry and the medical supply chain industry to continue producing, but under a new and very strict public health safety requirement, which may vary from case to case, from industry to industry. But it's the only way that will allow us to essentially require the vast majority of the population to self-quarantine and continue to provision hospitals and provision individuals with food and shelter at home.
So we need to basically increase the kind of health standards of these critical services, while at the same time providing some means to ease these, the suppliers or the companies involved in it into them.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And if the private sector is not doing it on its own, then this is where government intervention must come in. This is what happened during wartime, where the government says, well, you're going to have to stop producing cars because we want you to produce airplanes. We want you to produce tanks. And it wasn't, you do it voluntarily. You have to, right? Whereas the thinking right now is still in the public-private partnership. The thinking right now is let's bail out the airlines and let's bail out the, failing institutions and then, give them cash and say, do well, see you next time. Whereas this might be an opportunity, actually, if we're serious about inequality in the U.S. in particular. This is the time to buy, airlines on the cheap, right? and to redistribute their assets, redistribute their shares to workers, and reset the system on the right footing. So that, yes, you're interfering to save an industry, but at the same time, you're taking the opportunity to produce a more equitable system out of it, as opposed to bailing out the industry and allowing the top level executives to walk away with bonuses and with stock options that are now boosted with government intervention.
So if there's any concerned UK listeners listening, I've found an article from 2018 on countryfile.com. How much food does the UK currently produce? So this is back in 2018. The UK grows 61% of the food that it eats, according to the National Farming Union. And government sources sometimes quote a figure of 75%, but this includes non-indigenous items such as exotic fruit.
Where are we going to get our avocados?
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I'm just digging back down into this article. Historically, how much food has the UK produced? To find the highest historical rates for self-sufficiency in Britain, you need to go back to the 18th century, according to one of the professors at the Agricultural Ministry, Professor of Food Policy at the University of London, Tim Lang. He's saying historic modern-day lows include the eves of the First World War and Second World War, when we produced only around 33% of our food. The recent high was 82% in the 1980s. So there'll probably be something, because I know basically the reason I'm going into this, Fadhel, is because we are going down the supermarket now and the shelves are empty. You know, it's like people are, you know, this is...
You have to be prepared to fight.
This is what they said would happen if Corbyn got in. So it's kind of ironic.
So this brings us to another conversation here related to food and sustainability and climate change. I mean, climate change advocates have been calling for food sovereignty, not necessarily from an economic standpoint, the way we talk about it in the MMT community, especially in developing countries, but in terms of the carbon footprint of the food supply chain. Bringing a piece of lettuce from 3,000 miles away is not really sustainable. Yeah. And on a truck, right? In terms of the quality of the nutrients that you get from a piece of lettuce that's already 3 weeks old, that's been harvested like 3 weeks ago, whatever. Yeah. So this is yet another reminder of the importance of food sovereignty, local sustainable food, and that piece of avocado that you eat once a month becomes a much more delicious and much more cherished piece of...
As it should be, yeah.
As it should be, as opposed to expecting watermelons in the middle of a winter storm. And so kind of going back to eating, you know, fruits during their seasons and vegetables during their seasons, and going back to canning and this is not going back to the dark ages. This is going back to a sustainable food supply system that supports local farmers, that supports local vendors, and, you know, reduces the global carbon footprint of shipping bits and pieces of fruits and vegetables for no good reason other than, you know, supporting the big corporate food industry. This is a reminder of what the global food supply chain means, and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, in some cases, on smaller countries that happen to be so isolated and things like that, yes, we can handle, you know, a handful of countries where we have to, you know, ship them emergency food supplies and things like that. But for the vast majority of the planet, using indigenous agricultural techniques and indigenous crops is the best way to sustain, to build resilience in the system, and to create jobs and to create, you know, a decent level of economic activity that's sustainable and prosperous.
Okay, so the silver lining in being in lockdown and hiding from debt collectors is there's never been a better time to do online activism. So let's talk about Earth Day 2020. The Earth Day Network's mission is to diversify, educate, activate the environmental movement worldwide. First Earth Day was 1970, so it's 50th year this year. And our friend George Topolades in Melbourne, I hope I said his name right, is organising an online event called MMTers Marching Online for Earth Day 2020. We'll link to where you can find them on Facebook and Twitter in the show notes. And they're calling on MMTers from around the world to join together and march online beginning April 15th, right up to Earth Day 2020, in support of the Earth Day movement's efforts and to highlight how an understanding of MMT could also serve to support their calls for action. So the science is unanimous. The activist measures are in place. We've got Extinction Rebellion. People are organized. The measures to mitigate climate change have been talked about, worked out. We've talked about some of them just now. The missing piece of the puzzle was always, how are you going to pay for it? That's where MMT comes in. If only we were able to talk to the lead MMT economist for this online event. Wait a second, we are able to talk to the lead MMT economist for this event. Fadhel, let's unpack it. How are you going to pay for it?
Well, this is calling me the lead MMT economist for this is such an honor and an exaggeration. But there's going to be a lot of us in the MMT community essentially zooming in during that week for Earth Day, Earth Week. To engage with as many of the activists and the Earth Day movement around the world to invite people to think about how we pay for this. And I think the moment that we're living in right now, especially with governments coming up with trillions of dollars out of nowhere, when just 2 weeks ago they said you can't have a Green New Deal, we can't afford all this pie in the sky, big spending. Not only we're discovering how to pay for things. Nobody was taxed last week to pay for the $1 trillion. We didn't borrow from anybody. So governments can create money essentially by having Parliament or Congress vote to approve a particular budget. And we're also seeing as we speak that governments around the world are not worried about what the impact of the spending is in terms of inflation. What they're concerned about is mobilizing the physical productive resources to deal with the public purpose priority, which is the public health crisis. So we have, unfortunately, given the pandemic, we have the right moment with people's attention kind of shining a light on how public finances operate and how we set priorities and meet those priorities without bankrupting the country, without causing hyperinflation, and engaging with people who really care about the issues at hand here, which is climate change and the future pandemics that might ensue from much more intense level of CO2 emissions and so on, and connecting the dots with people who are building this movement for a global Green New Deal, for Green New Deals around the world, and saying we can afford these things so that when their governments and mainstream kind of establishment politicians or economists in their country say, oh, we can't afford your proposals, we don't have money for it, they can call their bluff and they can push back and provide a legitimate answer that demonstrates that we can afford these things, that is within reach. This is not a pie in the sky, and that this is actually an absolute necessity. I mean, we can't avoid it. Sooner or later, we're going to have to deal with this. We'd rather do this sooner so that we're dealing with fewer crises in the future related to climate change, related to public health crises. And we can do it in a prosperous way. This is not, we're not saying we're going to fight climate change and go back to the Stone Age and then give up our lifestyle and give up. We just have to adapt and adjust and build more structural resilience that happens actually to create millions of new jobs, good paying jobs. And we have to address the power structure that's actually standing in the way of these new structural adjustments. Because during normal economic times, their priorities is always, starting a war. Their priority is a tax cut for the rich. And they always know how to pay for it. We're saying we need governments that are truly democratic, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, that sets the priorities of the people first. And then we can pay for it the same way we paid for the COVID-19 intervention, the same way we paid for World War II, the same way we pay for all government expenditures. Just we're resetting the priorities to focus on healthier planet, on decent jobs, a more equitable economic system, more resilient public health system. And this is all within reach. It's possible. And our MMT community has been pretty clear on this for a while. And I think this is the time for us to engage with a much broader global network of climate activists who have the right intentions and have the right motivation and have all the energy that we need, and are often kind of brought to a halt when somebody says, how are you going to pay for it? Then they fall into the standard trap of saying, oh, we need to tax oil companies. Oh, we need to tax the rich to pay for this, which is a very dangerous logic, because if we want to tax oil companies in order to pay for a Green New Deal, for example, then by definition, as a matter of logic, then we want those oil companies to be even richer. so that we can tax them more and generate enough revenues to build the Green New Deal. So you don't want a system that says we want oil companies to generate even more profits and extract even more oil and gas so that we can take a fraction of their wealth to pay for a Green New Deal. We're saying is we need to tax them and regulate them out of existence. We don't need their money or their permission to start a Green New Deal. We tax and regulate financial institutions. We tax and regulate their market power out of existence, not because we need their money or their permission, but because we want to reduce speculation. We want to reduce their power and influence in politics. We want to reduce corruption. That's the reason for taxation, is not because we need their money. So this is what we say usually is decoupling the taxing and spending. So we tax them because we have to, because of other important reasons. We tax excessive wealth because we want to, fight oligarchy and protect democracy. And we spend on the national priorities, but always with an eye towards inflation. So when we spend, we say, what is this going to generate in terms of spending behavior for consumers and the private sector? And if we have the productive capacity to meet the demand for consumption of food and transportation and energy, then that's not going to be inflationary. But if we know that the spending is going to exceed our productive capacity, then the solution is we build more productive capacity and we increase competition in the system. We reduce the power and influence of big pharma, of big real estate companies, of institutions that control the supply chain, that control prices in the system. In other words, you democratize the economy too, not just democratize the political system. So these are common goals that we all have in the MMT community and the climate action community. This is just our moment to come together and speak with one voice. And we by far outnumber the establishment at the global level. We just have to have a single voice and a single policy platform to fight for the right kind of transformative change.
Now, let's just talk to that climate justice advocate just for a second that for the first time is hearing about taxing and spending and how it doesn't quite work how they think it works. I've found the most powerful way to cut through, because they think, obviously we're going to have to go to where the money is. We're going to have to take it off rich people and rich corporations in order to get our agenda across, in order to pay for our progressive proposals. And it's unfortunate that it's just a US thing, but it applies to all modern money systems. You've got this very powerful clip of the chairman of the Federal Reserve on 60 Minutes, Ben Bernanke. You can search it on YouTube. I think it's Scott Pelley asks him about the money for the bailout in 2008. Where did that money come from? Is that taxpayers' money? And the chairman of the Federal Reserve goes, no, we've got a computer at the Fed and we just use the computer to mark up the balances of the member banks, and that's where the money comes from. And you could always direct people to that and go, look, that's how money gets spent. They didn't get a bunch of gold coins and hammer them into the internet and they turned into dollars. They didn't, they just typed them into existence. And, it's right out there. I was wondering, do either of you, Patricia, Fadhel, have other sort of, just to give talking points to that activist that needs convincing that that's how governments spend?
Our government just now said, which our government, which is hardly progressive, has just now said that they are going to subsidize wages for any employee who would otherwise be laid off, and that those policies, alongside others, have an unlimited funding attached to them. There is no costing. There is no, we're going to have to pay for this in the future in taxes. There's none of that. There is just whatever it needs, we'll do it, unlimited.
This is the Tories' only Nixon can go to China moment, isn't it, basically? If the Labour government were doing it, it would be like,
exactly.
You've got to, this is insane, but, the Tories are just like,
but they haven't been met with any of the usual they haven't been hounded off with any of the usual how you're going to pay for it. There has been, however, some journalists who have been a little bit kind of genuinely clueless as to how is it possible to do something like that, and wondering where does the money come from. And then others who just say kind of the government is borrowing in order to do this, but borrowing from whom? If they're borrowing from the private sector to bail out the private sector, how does that even make sense? So all these questions, I think that if the language is wrong, right? We know the language is wrong, but if you start kind of going into trying to make sense out of these statements, people will realize that there are no constraints, financial constraints, and government will always do whatever it takes. And the question then becomes, why now? Why now? Maybe, yes, there is a crisis now, but you can't say, there's still poverty and there's still suffering in times when we considered not to be a crisis. Why do we consider that acceptable, that kind of suffering acceptable, but we don't consider this kind of suffering acceptable? This is my question that puzzles me because, well, in times of crisis, okay, so in the 1990s, I would go to a homeless man and say, we can't help you because this is not a crisis and your poverty is nothing, it's nothing to worry about. You see, it just didn't make sense to me.
And that's precisely the right way to frame this narrative, because if during this massive crisis we can afford this, then we can certainly afford it during much, much smaller crises of regular economic times when we only have 4% unemployment or 5%. Then in terms of actual spending and support for the most vulnerable people, it should definitely be very affordable. And yet now we're saying, the entire economic system needs a bailout and we can afford it and nobody's worried about inflation or anything. And just to, add to your earlier point about, paying people to stay home, a Republican politician earlier last week, when this was brought up in Congress and they were debating it, and he said, wait a minute, if we pay people to stay home, then a lot of people will be incentivized not to go to work. And we were like, well, that's precisely the point. I mean, he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that we actually want people to stay home because this is how you deal with the pandemic. He was still stuck in this notion of incentivizing people to work and not spending so much on creating the wrong kinds of incentives. But fortunately, he was in the minority view. Even the most conservative politicians recognize that this is what needs to be done. You pay people to stay home because we need people to decongregate from public spaces to minimize the spread of the virus.
And it's kind of hypocritical because, the whole of entrepreneurship is built on this premise of you're trying to build something that pays you a passive income that you don't have to show up to. Right, everything. I have a small business. I do my thing, and I make a living, not a killing. And I wouldn't call that entrepreneurship. It's something else. It's not entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is somebody that builds a system that scales, and now they don't have to show up to work anymore because it's paying them a dividend. Those people are heroes. But now all of a sudden we're like, well, you can't just pay people to stay at home. And it's like, well, your whole system's geared up to sort of make people that achieve that the winners. It's I just thought
to go back to your question about the climate activists that we need to invite into this conversation. Well, before we convince them of how the government spends, we need to engage in a process of unlearning. And the first thing that many environmental activists have probably engaged with is something at the local level, where they were trying to lobby the city to clean up the parks or to clean up the water source or something like that. And they dug into the administrative procedures of how to get it done. And they clearly know that the local state or city or municipality needs tax revenues. They need to free up financial resources from one type of expenditure into this particular new requirement. And then they know that it's taxes that pay for these things. So the process of engaging with climate activists is to kind of separate out how public finances work at the local, state, municipal level, where taxes actually pay for city spending and city and municipal expenditures, versus the sovereign national authority, the federal government or the national government in any other country, where the national government is the monopoly issuer of the national currency. Nobody else can issue it into existence. And there the logic is very different, because the national authority has to spend money into existence first in order for the rest of us to have that money, in order to borrow it and lend it and spend it within the private sector. So the logic is very different. You spend money into existence first, and then you tax some of it back at the national level. So then the meaning of what we call the national debt is very different than state or municipal debt or personal debt. So these are the first kind of bits of demystifying public finances. And usually it just takes a few minutes worth of a conversation to get that logic and people realize, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. So then why do they tell us we can't afford that? Why do they tell us this is going to cause inflation and hyperinflation? Then that leads to a whole series of questions that we're hoping to engage with during that Earth Day week in April to bring so many of the climate activists into the how do we pay for it, mode of thinking and start shifting the narrative using the MMT framework.
Okay, well, I think this is a great place to leave it now. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you guys. Thanks for continuing to speak to me, Patricia, after all these years.
I make an effort.
It's been great to talk to you. Thanks for being such a great friend to the show, Fadhel. We'll catch you soon. All right, everybody. Goodbye. That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon starting at $1 a month and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.